All right, everyone, welcome to part two. I just got cut off at the end of part one, and I want to give you a few more examples so you can really see how these emotional frameworks work. Okay, so in the last video, I ended by looking right here at uh, when tackling some of life's tougher topics. Here, I'm going to suggest, compared to the first web page, you would not feel as vulnerable as an audience member, as a parent in this case. And remember that feeling vulnerable to the risk is one of the major things that you want somebody to do if there is a threat or risk. If there is no threat or risk, perhaps it's unethical to use this framework. But I would say for drugs and kids, it's certainly a risk. And so you can see life's tougher topics just doesn't seem like strong enough language to maybe cue the idea of threat or risk. This just seems like it's something uncomfortable to talk about, and that's maybe not enough. So compared to our previous webpage, which did make me feel more vulnerable by pointing out that if I talk to my kids too late, 13 or 14, they might already be experimenting with drugs or drink. Comparatively, that one is much stronger and cues threat or risk in a way that this word choice simply doesn't. So it does come down to word choice sometimes. Otherwise, we can say, though, that a lot of these things, in terms of giving solutions to effectively solve the problem, these things do, in fact, exist inside of here. But you can see they're missing several strategies. So they're not doing number one, they are doing number two, giving specific actions. Are they appraising someone's ability to carry out the action? I'm going to suggest we see that right here. Conversations are one of the most powerful tools that parents can use. So it seems they are doing that one. If we wanted to go through and look at number four, feel the suggested action will effectively solve the problem. Probably we have a nice description of how to do things down here, so that looks really, really good, correct? If we want to keep looking, we could go to the next bullet point. Believe the cost associated with taking action is low. Seems pretty easy. I'm just having a conversation. This doesn't seem too challenging. It doesn't really talk about how easy it is. It just talks about that it's effective. So if we wanted to increase that framework, that it's easy to do, we could say something about how easy it is. Sitting down with your kids is one of the easiest things parents can do. Facilitating conversation with your children about drugs and drink is something that should start at a young age. Then we're starting to incorporate all of those frameworks. This isn't quite doing that. You can see it's close, but not quite there. In general, they're doing most of these things, though. And again, this functions almost as a checklist for the type of things that you want to say or should say inside of threat or risk-based emotional frameworks. If we want to look briefly just at the use of a threat framework, a very highly emotional framework from a public speaker that is known for his use of emotion and threat frameworks, that would be our current President Trump. And you can see here that we have a threat framework. Dems want illegal immigrants, of course, these are actually Trump quotes, to infest our country. That sounds, not only is it a metaphor in some way, right, that immigrants are insects or bugs in some way, but also that it is a threat or risk. And so we see this rhetoric being used on a daily basis. Because this is a newspaper, some of his quotes are split, but we see him using that again down here. These are crippling loopholes. So if you are crippled, you are threatened, you are at risk, you are weak, right? So we see that President Trump tends to use a lot of this, even off the top of his head. This is one of his major frameworks that he uses. And as we all know, this was fairly successful with a segment of voters in the last election. If we want to look at the exact same issue, but not using the threat or risk framework, so we can say the issue itself isn't a threat or risk, it's the rhetorical framework, the language chosen. We can go to the Cato Institute, which is also a highly conservative think tank, and we can look at the way that they're talking about this issue. And if you look through this one paragraph right here, you will not find, of course, this disagrees with President Trump's actions, even though they are both of the same political party. You will see that there is no threat or risk rhetoric used in this piece. So go ahead and give it a read. And so you can see just how powerful these rhetorical frameworks are, these emotional frameworks are. In this case, the threat or risk framework, applied by some, not applied by others. And it really changes our views of reality, of what's happening in the situation, and of course, how we should emotionally respond. If we wanted to look at the rhetoric of this piece quickly, this seems to be sort of based in outrage. People should be outraged by this, right? Has rightfully drawn outrage that these children are kept in cages and separated from their parents. So we see some facts about it, as well as a new solution. We could tie that directly into, they're saying President Trump's solution does not work, but there's a different way of doing this. That ties us directly into a solution. As we know, people are emotionally persuaded when they see that there is a viable solution. And you see that here in our list, right? A way to carry out the actions. So we can see the Cato Institute is doing this. Of course, do we need this framework in the reading to do this? No, I think everybody knows that you want a solution to your problems, right? That's something you've learned in previous courses, and you just know that to be true from life. But we can see the elements, again, the checklists of this article in emotional persuasion, so that people are not emotionally overwhelmed or overloaded. We can see these things happening inside of here. And if we want to talk about the use of emotion, of course, we could say this is sort of that older use of emotion that we've talked about, still powerful and poignant, and that is that we have children locked in cages here. And so clearly we're supposed to sympathize and empathize with these children and with these immigrants. Much, much different than the threat or risk rhetorical framework, also playing on the emotions that we see. So we have outrage versus threat or risk in these two conservative writings on our current immigrant situation. I thought just for a moment we'd return to older course readings and look at why these essays, which we enjoy so much for their literariness and because they're very, very beautiful and can be powerful in their own way, might not always function well as the most persuasive frameworks. That is to simply speak like this in public might not change people's minds. To deliver messages like this, were we a public group seeking the favor of citizens, that might not work very well. At least as we talked about this in the past, most of the essay is literary. We don't know what it means. We don't know what it means to think like a mountain. As we know from our research on emotion, if we wanted to go back to our checklist, we'd have to ask, as a piece of writing, is thinking like a mountain doing these things in a very, very specific way? Do we feel personally vulnerable to the risk? Not really. This is a story where an observer, we're watching someone else who is hunting, right? We're learning through them, but we don't feel personally at risk, which in terms of public rhetoric, and of course this is literature, but in terms of public rhetoric, this could be seen as kind of weak for not doing these things. Does it have useful and very specific information about precautionary actions? Not really, no. The best we get is this last paragraph. We all strive for safety, prosperity, comfort, long life, and dullness. But how to do that, how to achieve those things, we don't really know. We're just left with these little dictums that are very, very sort of abstract and conceptual. So all this is a really, really great nature essay. You probably couldn't see this as persuading people to change their actions. It doesn't even tell them what to do. There's no how to, and there are not many of these type of things in there in very, very detailed way. The way that we would expect to see, say, when we looked at the Cato Institute a moment ago, and it offered specific strategies for helping the immigrant crisis, or when we looked at the Drug-Free America types of web pages and the very specific strategies. So you can see there very, very different emotional engagement with this piece than with some of the web writing or the public writing that we looked at earlier. If we wanted to look at another piece we spent a lot of time with, this is, of course, Silent Spring, Chapter 2, The Obligation to Endure. We could run this through our grid and say, well, this got a lot of public attention upon its release. It was seen as a scientific document, even though there was pushback. I wonder if it does a better job than Thinking Like a Mountain of meeting some of these emotional needs that a public has. Does it make people feel vulnerable to the risk very specifically? I'm going to suggest more so than Thinking Like a Mountain, based upon sections like this that we do not see in Thinking Like a Mountain. This lone sentence, the most alarming of all man's assaults upon the environment is the contamination of air, earth, rivers. So probably that sounds like much more of a risk-based statement or a threat-based statement than we see elsewhere. We see that the pollution is irrecoverable. We can't change these things. We have some rhetoric, the chain of evil. That sounds like threat or risk-based framework that we're actually getting here inside of Silent Spring. That's not anything that we got in Thinking Like a Mountain. So we're starting to see why Silent Spring might have had a bigger public impact, even though it is also literary. Why it had a bigger public impact than something like Thinking Like a Mountain. It seems to get closer to meeting some of these needs. If we were to read the whole book, we would see specific actions that people can take. We would see that it's pretty easy. So Silent Spring slowly, were you to read the whole book, would meet many of these, even if it does so probably more in a much more meandering manner than, say, those web pages that we looked at or the Cato Institute statements. Yet this is getting the work of public emotion done, and likely that's why it found its place in its time inside of the public sphere. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this talk and these examples. Thinking of your life form paper, Silent Spring is a pretty good model for what you're doing. It has all of the rhetoric that we've talked about previously, but you can see it is also engaging the emotions in some ways, the ways that I just mentioned. So these rhetorical frameworks, these public community-based rhetorical frameworks also do live inside of this very literary piece. So this is what we're shooting for in your life form paper, and I hope you enjoy writing it, and I'll have follow-up videos to give you more advice on how to do this. All right, thank you.